if they so sympathise with the terrorists, what's to say that when that flare goes up, the state will be standing on the same side as us?
Firstly, Douglas versus Dave Smith. I'm not sure if any of the audience has watched this, but they should. It was quite an interesting sort of watch. So Dave Smith, he's a comedian. He's a podcaster. He's a libertarian. He's been on Joe Rogan shows a number of times, and Douglas Murray was on with him. And Douglas launched immediately into this criticism that some of the people who are on Joe Rogan's show, who are maybe on the right, who are maybe sort of advancing sort of theories on history, particularly sort of the reputation of Churchill, World War II revisionism, potentially Holocaust revisionism. And he was sort of worried that they are too enthusiastic with some of their critiques and therefore sort of undermine basically the position of the West. And maybe they get things wrong. You know, they're not necessarily experts, was the phrase that he used. I've always taken umbrage with this idea of the woke right, which is, I think, something that's been pushed by people like Jamie Lindsay, because it seems to be sort of a veiled attack on essentially Christian conservatives. But there is a tendency, I mean, you might not agree, but it seems like there is a tendency among some commentators to sort of hack away at certain theories of history, certain ideas of history, while they're criticizing sort of elites in the West, in this country, in the US, who've got us into some of the position we're in now. They sort of simultaneously hack away at some sort of central, important parts of our history and sort of undermine some institutions which are important. So I wonder if what your take on that conversation was, and whether you think that is the case. Or, you know, was Douglas Murray, did he go in all guns blazing? Was he too harsh? What's your thoughts?
So I've watched it about 3 times because the Douglas Murray and Dave Smith debate is so enjoyable. However, from the outset, I will say that I think Dave Smith is a good faith actor. He is not just reducible to being a comedian. He is a member of the Libertarian Party, and people thought that whether or not the Libertarian Party has any chance in hell of ever getting elected, he was a viable candidate to put forward for president rather than Chase Oliver, who represents a very unpopular and thin sliver of the left wing of the Libertarian Party, hence why Douglas calls them political bisexuals in the podcast. And so Dave Smith is educated and he is engaging in the debate in good faith. The phenomenon Douglas was highlighting was that there are people who either get facts wrong, like Daryl Cooper about Churchill, which Andrew Roberts and Victor David Hanson have written extensively on refuting individual items of that, or who engage in admitted hyperbole in Daryl Cooper's case by saying that Churchill was the true villain of World War II. I think that's incorrect, not least of all because by his own criteria, when he was discussing that with Tucker Carlson, they said, look at the net impact of Churchill's legacy. Britain doesn't feel like Britain anymore. And as someone who lives here, per Douglas's rule of only speaking in countries that you visited, that is true. Britain doesn't feel like Britain anymore. But if you transported Churchill through time and showed him Britain today, he would be on the so-called far right, because he would be very unhappy with what was done, and he did not intend things like the 1952 UN Refugee Convention or the European Convention on Human Rights to apply to anyone except Dutch Jews, and certainly not Albanian illegal migrants and Ghanaian sex offenders who can't be evicted because their kids don't like foreign chicken nuggets. Right? That's not what Churchill intended. A lot of Douglas's critiques, because he went in very hard off the back, centered around the term expert. And I think his mistake was using the term expert to be synonymous with credible. Because ever since the COVID era, all of us have a Pavlovian response to the notion we should trust experts, because nobody has done more to discredit the use of listening to expertise than the experts that the state has appointed because they align with their broader ideological goals. I'm thinking Anthony Fauci, for example, who misrepresented the fact that he was funding gain-of-function research via Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance at the Wuhan lab, who admitted that he lied about the efficacy of masks. Originally, he said it's not going to stop anything, and then he said it's absolutely going to stop COVID, even though that wasn't the case. And he said, well, we had to tell the media that so that all of the PPE equipment wasn't bought up by citizens when we needed it at a hospital. So he admitted that he was misrepresenting this. He was censoring folks like Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Carol Sikora, who had drafted the Great Barrington Declaration, which was going to be the selective shielding model of combating pandemics rather than widespread lockdowns. And he had coordinated within the CDC plans to try to discredit them publicly so that they could push lockdowns without any opposition. So all of these things during the COVID era made it so that experts were untrustworthy. And so to say we need more experts around as a solution to the errors put out by the likes of Daryl Cooper, whose motivations I'm not going to try and, read like tea leaves. He could just be mistaken. He could be a bad faith actor. I don't know. I've never met him. But to counteract those mistakes, yes, more debate is always a good thing, and Daryl Cooper has refused to do so. But just saying we need experts here is not the way to go about it, because who determines expertise? Is it credentials afforded by the same sorts of universities that Douglas has brilliantly critiqued in Madness of Crowds and War on the West? Is it track record of correct predictions? Because like Douglas, though I do, he's a bit of an intellectual hero of mine, but I think he got elements of COVID wrong. He got elements of January 6th wrong. He supported the Iraq War, and I think, they were at least led into the country under false pretenses. So what determines expertise or what determines credibility? That was not laid out. And so using the term expert to be synonymous with credible was his great mistake there. But I do think Douglas is right when he said to Dave, you have a lot of opinions about Israel specifically. And Douglas can claim to have a lot of credibility on Israel. I've just reviewed his new book on democracies and death cults for Courage Media. And while I am neither Jewish nor have any connection to Israel greater than I do Iceland, it's a useful book because you can realize the genocidal ideology that is within Hamas that is laying dormant all across the West now because of mass immigration and multiculturalism, and how unexpectedly a massacre can flip your civilization on its head overnight, and how Israel took the side of its people, and there's a very real fear that our governments will not necessarily take the side of ours under DEI laws and all this sort of thing. What Douglas is saying is that he has spent time in Israel. He has interviewed people on the front line. He's interviewed politicians. He's interrogated the claims presented to him. And so he can claim credibility because he has not done his own research. He's done research on behalf of a lot of other people who can't get out there. And for Dave to then make the claim that, for example, Gaza is an open-air concentration camp, or it bears a lot of characteristics of a concentration camp, when he's never visited the region, when he doesn't know the scale of these blockades that he was saying were so damaging, when, yes, he has been presented with lots of images of human suffering from Gaza, but he perhaps doesn't realize that lots of those buildings were leveled because booby traps, bombs, and weapons caches were disarmed using bits of technology, and Hamas was embedding all of those explosives in schools, hospitals, and residential areas, hence the devastation. Lots of those things that he doesn't realize, he doesn't know them because he hasn't been there and done the legwork that Douglas has. So it's not that lived experience has a greater premium than someone's ability to be independently informed by doing lots of research and reading primary sources. But it does mean that if you go out there and do first-hand research, you can claim to have credibility on an issue. You're not necessarily an expert, but you have credibility in a field. And that's what I think Douglas was right about, and I think Dave was wrong to dismiss that as a fallacious argument.
So it's kind of this distinction between sort of expertise and good learning versus credentialism.
Yes.
If you're, reading a work of history and you're dealing with an historian who's been in the archives with the primary sort of source material versus somebody who's talking about what somebody has said, then obviously the better work of history, most likely, is the guy who's done the original archival research
and that's
been with the sources.
That's the issue that's raised with Daryl Cooper. He has tweeted before that he's read David Irving's books and he thinks they're good sources. Now, David Irving makes a number of errors that historians like just Tick History on YouTube have pored over and put side by side with other sources and corrected. And he's made those in his work. So if you're not doing first-hand archival research and you're relying on a lot of second-hand historical testimony, and then you don't compare and contrast different historical accounts, like other historians work with Irving's, you might end up believing one account that is filled with errors, and you don't know what errors it's filled with because more up-to-date history might have already corrected those. And I think that's the point being made, right?
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing about David Irving, for example, is that he actually does hold a lot of the sort of archive and source material
on Dresden,
and, and diaries. But a lot of the historians who actually use those materials, come to different conclusions, and there is a large degree of consensus against what what he says and what his arguments are.
The idea that Hitler was downplaying his anti-Semitism, for example, that's just inaccurate.
No, he wrote a whole book on it.
Yeah, he wrote it in the 1920s. He was giving internal party
which
speeches.
Then became the Bible for the Nazi Party.
Even if you dispute the veracity of certain passages in table talks, he wasn't hiding that he was having these conversations with the internal Nazi Party apparatchiks. And then we do have the transcripts of his speeches. He was not restrained in his belief that capitalism and communism were both conspiracies by Jews to collapse the world economy and cripple everyone who wasn't Jewish. So even if he's just using terms like global capitalism or global communism, he's using them as dog whistles for a broader Jewish plot. So he wasn't hiding it. And so wherever Darrell has garnered that claim from, again, I'm not trying to attribute ill motivations to Darrell. Wherever he's garnered that claim from, it's inaccurate. And so if you're relying on second-hand accounts, or even one interpretation of the primary sources that isn't contrasted with other interpretations, then you might get things wrong. And so then this comes back to the point about who you platforming, who you consulting as credible. If, as Joe he has had on Darrell Cooper, and then has not followed up with someone else like Neil Ferguson, for example. Andrew Roberts, Victor Davis Hanson, who'd be a great guest on Rogan's show, actually. Then he is failing to expose his audience to either a correction or a counter-narrative. He's not mandated to do that, by the way, but Douglas's point was, look, the reason the mainstream media has exhausted their credibility is because they didn't do that. They became anti-Trump partisans for ages. They weaponized Joe Rogan's COVID diagnosis by graying out his face on CNN to make him look more ill than he actually was. Like that's totally absurd. So Joe Rogan and podcasters like Dave Smith, sometimes like me, maybe, definitely at the same scale of audience, they take on more credibility than the establishment, formerly mainstream media. And so you do have an onus to ensure that you try and get things right, that you try and have a bit of balance.
But then I guess then there's this broader discussion that you have this establishment media, you have the sort of established opinion, and the reason someone like Joe Rogan has become so successful is because he has, over a number of years, platformed people who have sought to raise interesting questions about what the consensus has been, right?
Yes.
And that is why he's popular. So I guess he doesn't necessarily view his role as somebody who he hasn't traditionally viewed his role as somebody who needs to sort of balance two sides of an argument, because he still thinks that there is an established narrative and there are these people around who are just asking questions. And I think Douglas's point is that there's a danger that when it comes to bringing on comedians of sorts, that they can say, well, I'm just asking questions. They can put forward an idea which is potentially dangerous or potentially misleading, and then when they are rebuffed, they can say, well, I was just asking questions. I'm just a comedian. Yeah, exactly. It's a Mon Bailey tactic. And I wonder whether people like Joe Rogan, people in alternative media now have to reckon with the fact that actually they are an extremely popular source for opinions, for news, and they're no longer just countering an established narrative. They're actually helping create an environment where serious discussion over complex issues and ideas about history are occurring. So, maybe now is the time for someone like Joe Rogan to consciously platform people who are potentially in disagreement. I thought it was interesting that he had both of them on at the same time.
Yes.
And
it was valuable.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not going to try and tell Joe how to run his show, but based on Joe's long-standing commitment to seeking the truth and risking offending people by asking uncomfortable questions in order to pursue that, I think if you're met with, or if one of your guests is met with a large amount of criticism and you then don't follow up on that, especially when that guest is proven to have gotten something factually wrong, I think that is a wavering of commitment to the truth. The criticism I will have of Douglas's approach to this is that Douglas seemed very concerned with the second order effects of platforming these people at all. And I agree with Douglas when he says we should be talking about the primary things rather than the secondary things, as politics often does. So, for example, when Dave Smith mentioned in the broader conversation about neoconservatism and the intervention in Ukraine, which I happen to side more with Dave on than I do Douglas on this issue, when Dave brought up Paul Wolfowitz as someone who is interested in waging wars of regime change abroad, Douglas became concerned that people who weren't Dave, who himself is Jewish, could take the name Wolfowitz and run away with it and make anti-Semitic conspiracy theories out of it. And I would say that the same accusation is often spuriously made of Douglas by saying, oh look, here are all these members of the Muslim Brotherhood, here are all these organizations they decide to fund, here are all these people that work for those organizations that then soft pedal terrorism, like Hizb ut-Tahrir. And then someone will come along and say, well, you're focusing so much on Muslims, don't you just really hate them? Aren't you spreading Islamophobic conspiracy theories? Itself a phrase invented by the Muslim Brotherhood. I would just say that, it is not Dave Smith's responsibility if a bunch of anonymous grippers on Twitter decide to make a straw man out of a substantive argument retroactively. And I think that Douglas is right to be concerned about the growth of unchallenged insanity, especially in an environment that rewards sensationalism with monetization on X.
Partly because then it flips all the way back round, and then you have this whole roster of people who've said misleading things, which then can be leveled against people on the right in general.
Yes.
Right? Which is a tactic that the left or the liberal establishment is very keen to do.
Yes,
to use.
But that's not Dave and Joe's fault. And then the final point on the woke right, it's a phrase that doesn't make sense because woke has a very specific meaning. Eric Kaufman has defined it as the sacralizing, making sacred, of racial, sexual, and gender minority groups. And then he said all sorts of cultural socialism prescriptions to redress their grievances come downstream from that. I default to self-proclaimed literal communist Ash Sarkar on this one, herself being chronically woke. And she says woke culture is the redistribution of power, wealth, land, I'll add recognition to this as well, along class, race, gender, and sexuality lines. So it's gay race communism. Woke is gay race communism, and there is no gay race communism on the right unless they are masquerading as being right-wing because the left left me, but actually agreeing with everything. All of the stages of the leftist resolution except the last one, which, frankly, someone like James Lindsay, who's peddling the phrase woke right, does.
Yeah, well, I suppose part of his argument is that there's a group of people who are overly censorious, who want to sort of police the boundaries of acceptable thought on the right. I
think it's the inverse,
that's exactly what he's doing. He just doesn't like that they're policing it in a different way than he is.
Yes.
So he's sort of come up with a term for it. Okay, so I guess that sort of maybe gives me the answer to the next question. But Piers Morgan quoted you on his show, I think, last night.
He didn't quote me. I don't know who he quoted.
Well, apparently you were saying Douglas absolutely smashed it, but clearly your view is a bit more nuanced on that. So
Piers Morgan quoted a tweet that said that Douglas Murray destroyed ignorant Dave Smith, and he said it came from me, and I just didn't tweet that. I didn't. Now, again, I think Douglas made valid points about being credible, not about being experts. I side with Douglas on the Israel issue in that, as he says in his book, if October the 7th were to happen in our country, our government coming to our defense in a capacity any less than the Israeli government came to the defense of its own people is an indictment not of the Israelis but of our government. And as we've seen with the continued cover-up around the rape gang trial, something comparable to October 7th has happened for decades in the UK, and our government's betrayed us, whereas the Israeli government has defended them. And as far as Dave goes, I think he makes cogent arguments about Ukraine, and I don't think he needs to have visited Ukraine to make that argument, actually, because the bellicosity of our leaders trying to deploy troops on the ground from Europe and the US into Ukraine, Europe first, of course, but NATO more broadly, and their subsidy of the conflict using American taxpayer and UK taxpayer dollars and pounds means that we do actually have a stake in this, even if we haven't been to the land, because it will be you and me, mate, that get called up for the draft. And I'm not keen to defend a liberal international rules-based order which has failed on almost all of its foreign policy ventures since being instituted. And when we're critiquing Vladimir Putin, quite rightly, for incarcerating and assassinating his own political opposition, but my own government is arresting 12,000 people a year, more than pre-war Russia, which don't have statistics on how many they do now, but more than pre-war Russia, for speech violations. So we are acting in a very similar way while calling ourselves liberal and democratic. I don't want to fight to defend that order. Like, I don't want to fight to defend an order that discriminates against me as a white man from hiring in state institutions and demonizes me culturally as everything wrong with civilization. Like, I don't want to fight to defend that. So I think that Dave is perfectly entitled to have his critiques of the interventionist foreign policy, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, because he's spending money on it, and it'll be his kids and you and me that will be called up to fight for it.
This is a deviation slightly, but I don't think maybe we should talk about this at length separately. But I do wonder, do you have a sort of grudging sense that if we did end up at war, you would sort of step up and do your duty, even for, or are you completely checked out? Would you be completely checked out?
Who are we going to war with? For what? Like, if we were invaded, and we are
with Russia,
we're being invaded,
which I don't want, by the way.
No, no.
To make that very, very clear.
I have no appetite to go and shoot at some poor Russian conscript who's also being forced into the front lines by his own dictatorial government. But we are currently being invaded across the channel. We've got record number of channel crossings. As we spoke about last time, Eritreans and Afghans are 20 times more likely than the British man to commit a sex offence against our women and girls. Are we allowed to do anything about that? No, we're forced to pay for it for an escalating cost. And if we complain about it, we're called far right and racist. So, like, would I defend my country were it being invaded in a military capacity? Yeah, because I defend my home and my family and all the roads and little comforts I know. Would I enlist or comply with conscription to go overseas to fight for the rules-based international order when it's neither liberal nor democratic? No thanks.
So there really is a distinction between being shipped out overseas to sort of defend the periphery, or I guess the centre of Europe, as opposed to sort of fighting on the beaches, fighting on the landing grounds if some fleets rocked up at the shore. Okay. I guess just lastly on that point, I think it'll be very interesting to read your review of Douglas Murray's new book, which is coming out soon on courage.
It should already be out by the time this episode is out.
Okay, perfect. So everybody go and read that, and then obviously go and read Douglas Murray's book. I'm also interested to read that as well.
It is very good.
Is it good? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
People who have been frustrated with Douglas's interventionist foreign policy will still read the book and get a lot out of it, because the warning is not about taking more interventionist measures abroad. It's about looking at our own civilizations and seeing the rot within. Mm-hmm. Because if Hamas was able to lie quiet for 20, 30 years and build a tunnel network under Israeli schools, hospitals and homes that is larger than the London Underground network, to embed their operatives in yard work jobs so that they could scope out all of the homes of Israelis and which one had a safe house. If they could stockpile weapons and misappropriate UN funds and hide rockets under the cribs of children and tunnel through their own hospitals and use their own people as human shields, do we really doubt that people that share their ideology couldn't work their way into our institutions? And that is a seriously chilling thought, because we've had a lot of discourse, not from swivel-eyed loons and accelerationist racists, but from the likes of David Betts and Tim Stanley, and even Inaya Falarin Iman now, who criticised me for saying that there's some anti-white racism and she's now changed her mind on it, about ethnic conflict and civil war. And as I've said, when Hamas attacked Israel, Israel sided with its people. If that ideology, sympathetic to Hamas, is embedded in our institutions to the extent where the BBC, the state broadcaster, gets the son of a Hamas official to narrate a documentary it does about the plight of the Palestinians, if they so sympathise with the terrorists, what's to say that when that flare goes up, the state will be standing on the same side as us? That is the lesson from Douglas's book. It's utterly chilling, but you should definitely read it.
Yeah, and it's worth clarifying that that documentary was withdrawn when they sort of realised, but the point still stands that the fact that it's even possible to get to this position when people kicked up a fuss,
complained about
it. Okay, but yeah, so the point stands that within our institutions, people with subversive ideologies are more than capable of infiltrating